Hello, everybody. Welcome. So good to see so many faces. We'll just give everybody a minute here to enter our learning space, our virtual learning space. I'll remind you as you come in that we really encourage you to have your videos on if it's appropriate for you. It allows us to create more community when we can see one another face to face, panim al panim. But I will also remind you to please mute yourself as you come into the space. Our format will be as it has been all these months that Rabbi Kulik and I will be in conversation with our guest today for the first 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will open the space for you to ask whatever questions or share whatever is on your mind as well. So welcome. Just a reminder to mute yourself as you come in. All right, I am going to get started because
he is good. That's why I had him back.
I like to reward behavior. Karen, I'm asking to mute. I can't. Oh, there we go. I got you. All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. West End, Micah, and others who may be joining us. We're so glad you're here. I am delighted on behalf of Rabbi Kulik and I and myself to introduce our guest today, Rabbi Angela Warnick Buchdahl. She is the senior rabbi, also an ordained and invested cantor at Central Synagogue in New York. She is also my classmate from the Hebrew Union College. She is my friend, and I was just reminding her that she not only was my study partner, but I have memories of traveling up to her apartment in Westchester when we were just students to study together for, I don't know what we were studying, but I think it may have been like right after she gave birth to her first son, Gabriel. Maybe that's when I made the trip.
That makes sense.
Because I was on maternity leave or just sort of laying low at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, because did you have him while we were still?
I had him before my last year of rabbinical school. So yeah.
Okay, so that must have been what was going on. All right. Well, anyway, and Gabriel's a senior in college now. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's been a while.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so Rabbi, thank you so much for joining us. It's such a treat. I think a lot of our folks here on Zoom know of you or know you, have either zoomed in or live streamed into a central service at some point, or read some of something you perhaps have written, or seen you on YouTube. But you know, it's just a thrill to have you. And this series, which thank you again to our Federation for supporting, is on the topic of American Jewish identity, anti-Semitism in Israel, which we could spend the next 24 hours talking about those three topics, but we won't. We just have an hour, and we start all of our sessions by asking our guest rabbi to do a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, on the progressive American Jewish community today. So if you could start there, and then we'll go and see where our conversation takes us.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I would just say that it's really nice to be with you in Nashville, which I imagine is where most of you all are, and really in particular to be with my old friends, Lori and Flip. Lori, my dear Heverita, she helped me get through my last years of rabbinic school, which were very hard once I had a baby. My head was not there, so she probably helped me get to the finish line. And to meet her wonderful colleague, Rabbi Kulik, who I've just heard the most amazing things about. And I love the model that you join as communities across denominations to talk about the Jewish community, because really, I guess one of the things I would say is I think that there's much, much more in common than there are differences between us. So to partner together is really wise. So in terms of like a SWOT analysis, there's so many ways that I could start this, but I think I will just start by saying that the American Jewish community today, unlike the American Jewish community probably of my childhood, is the most diverse, probably politically and racially and across interfaith marriage and even like across like family makeup of any Jewish community in American history. And I would say that basically creates a ripple out effect of both strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So I'll just talk a little bit about how kind of I see that and how it plays out. When I was a child growing up, before I was born, I would say that intermarriage rates in the 50s and 60s was like virtually nil. And you probably know stories of families that if a child intermarried out, the family would sit Shiva. And it was as if they had completely left the community. By the time I was born, which was 1972, and I was not born in America, but at that time, I think that the Jewish community's intermarriage rate was somewhere in the neighborhood of 20%. It was relatively small. And in the 70s, when I was growing up, 92% of the children of interfaith marriages would leave the Jewish community, who did not identify as Jewish whatsoever. So I was part of a very tiny slice, 8%, that actually remained within the Jewish community from the 1970s as a product of, I was both a product of interfaith and interracial marriage. So I would say that was seen as like a major problem. Now, I moved to America right at the same time that the Reform movement actually changed its standing on interfaith families. There was a big outreach sermon that was given in 1978 by the president of the Reform movement, Rabbi Alex Schindler of blessed memory. And he actually really changed the way that the Reform movement approached families like mine. And so I got to grow up at a time where my Jewish community was very embracing of my Korean mother, who never converted, very embracing of me and my sister, not asking us to convert in order to be part of the Jewish community, even though we were products of patrilineal descent, not matrilineal descent. We became bat mitzvah on the bima. My mom got to participate and be a part of that. So this really changed its trajectory. Fast forward, and there are reasons that I think that we can say are good and bad. We now have an intermarriage rate that is over 70% in the non-Orthodox community in America, at least the last time we checked with the Pew report. And the good part of this, and I think an opportunity, is that they would say that 45% of the children of those interfaith marriages are identified either wholly as Jewish or in some way as partially as connected in some way to the Jewish community. So 45% is a very far distance from 8%, which is what it was. But the rate is much, much higher. And so there are trade-offs to this. I think what we've done is, I think among the strengths is we feel less tribal than we used to be. That's also in many ways a weakness. You're less able to walk into a room and just have your Judar pick out the Jews in the room. There's a comfort in feeling like you know who your people are and you can pick them out by their last name and by their face. And that you're going to share a certain common vocabulary and sense of humor and all of that. But if you weren't a part of that club, it felt very hard to get into it, but when it was sort of clubby and tribal that way. And I think that now when children and families look up and see me as a rabbi, they really see a very different possibility of who can belong in the Jewish community. And I'm even just looking at the Zoom screens here, and I see much more diversity than I would imagine. And you're in Nashville, right? And New York feels very much this way when I look out into my pews. So there are strengths and challenges with that. I think part of what is another strength is I think that there's a possibility for the Jewish community to actually grow in this way. If we have every Jew finds a non-Jew, but more than 50% of them raise their children as Jews, we could actually grow in that way. Now, we could argue whether or not, how does that change the nature of the community? There are real pluses to that, and there are also things that we lose at the same time. And so I think that we have to think about what all that means, but I think there are lots of opportunities. When we talk about we're going to talk about anti-Semitism and other things, think about the bridges that are built now that we count Jews of color in the Jewish community at 15%. Whether or not you want to quibble around whether it's 12% or 15%, the bottom line is when we talk about Blacks and Jews, we can't ignore that there are Black Jews also. And that when we think about that, these are not two separate communities, but we actually have people who are bridge builders who can understand what it is to be a Jew and to be Black and could help connect the communities that sometimes we see as having increasing distance between them. There are ways that actually having a more diverse community helps us build bridges outside of our own community in ways because we have insiders that are also connected in other ways. I I mean, I could go on and on about kind of some of the possibilities and the dangers there. But I think that this is whether or not you want to. I think the conservative movement, and Rabbi Kulik, you can step in if you think it's different. But I think that the conservative movement's approach to rising intermarriage rates was build the walls a little bit higher. Meaning, I think that to this day, the conservative movement still does not allow any of its rabbis to perform interfaith marriages. They've certainly lowered the barriers to including interfaith families, but I wouldn't say that it's quite an outright full embrace in terms of all the possibilities of what they can be a part of in a conservative synagogue. And so I think that there's, and the reform movement kind of took the opposite tack of like throw it wide open. I think that there are certain ways that has not always been, there are costs to that, I would say. But I do think that the reform movement has grown much, much larger in part because of that sense of open embrace. And I think, honestly, we've been enriched by it. So I think this is kind of the big picture, I think, SWOT analysis of, I think, what is kind of the most fundamental shift in the Jewish community of my lifetime. And what we're seeing comes from it.
Yeah. Thank you, Rabbi, so much. Rabbi Kulik, did you want to follow up with that?
Yeah, in terms of, following on it's interesting to see how many of these things can be taken, as you well said, as both a strength and a weakness, and maybe a threat and an opportunity, depending on how we deal with the different cards that we are given at this time. But I was thinking, for example, a couple of generations ago, the role of rabbis was to introduce Jews to the American culture, which they did very successfully, I would say. Nobody needs a rabbi today to be introduced into the American culture. And the question is, maybe, or perhaps the challenge today is how to introduce or reintroduce Judaism to the American Jews. And in that tension that is always given and has going for generations throughout our history between the particular and the universal, my question to you is, what is your take on how to preserve this universal outreach and growing from the diversity, and still at the same time, how can we, or what is the role of the particular within that universal?
I think that's a great question. And I feel like it's a constant tension. What I think that, what I'd like for us to maybe frame it, or one way to think about it, is that we're universal in that I'd like for us to think not of our community as a peoplehood that is organized by DNA that matches, or a certain kind of, the way your hair is curly, or what that on markers that are essentially unchangeable sort of, genetic, scientific, markers. And some of it's not scientific at all, but less that. And that what I'd like to lean into that's particular is not the way we look or the way we talk or even necessarily the foods we eat. What should be particular are Jewish behaviors that come rooted out of our tradition. So that means, like, I would like to see that what we lean into is like a true let's just start with Shabbat. I would love it for what we lean into as particularism, which is, by the way, extremely countercultural, especially right now, is that we're a community that actually really believes that we can sanctify time, and that we're going to live differently than everyone else one day a week. And that day is what actually enables us to understand what life is truly all about. So if we could actually just have every Jew do Shabbat, like, that is very deeply particular in a certain way in the way we observe it, and actually would unify us on something that's very real. Then it could also be about practices around tzedakah, or practices around how we treat people in business dealings, the way we treat our parents and honor them, the way we behave in lots of ways. And some of it is ritual, because I think that helps mark us as separate and different. Laws of kashrut. I think that while I keep kosher in a particular way, which is biblical kashrut and probably would not be seen as kashrut by an Orthodox Jew, for me, it's one of the ways that I distinguish myself as particular. And I think we can lean into those practices. What I'd like for us to do, though, is move away from the particularism that came from things that you were either born with or not born with. Because then Judaism truly does become a private club that you can never truly join. I mean, my Korean mother, who lived within this Jewish community of ours for now more than 40 years, in many ways, the Jewish language spoke to her very much. She actually resonated with the wisdom tradition, and she considered conversion twice, once right before my bat mitzvah, and once when my one of my first cousins was killed in a brutal robbery at a store where he was working. And she turned to the Jewish tradition and Jewish language for support, but ultimately didn't convert because she said, I feel like as a Korean immigrant and a woman with this cultural background, that even if I converted, I can never be fully Jewish. Now, that always was a great sadness to me that that's the way she felt. And I don't know that that's necessarily true, but, we lived in a one synagogue community that welcomed her very much, but welcomed her very much as like a revered guest and never fully as a member in a sense. And so I think that that's what I would like for us to move away from, is that kind of particularism. But we should be leaning into the particularism of Jewish practice and behavior and halakha in the sense of the way we walk through the world.
I love that you shared that, because I work with the conversion students who come through our congregation, and consistently I see and have the conversation with many of them that the biggest hurdle is not the learning, even the language, but this sense of authenticity in identity.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling
Mm-hmm.
like I can make that I am statement, I am Jewish, and feel it authentically. That is really a struggle for a lot of people. And I think sometimes we put that hurdle in front of them unknowingly, even if when we don't mean to. But that I think allows us to segue into, I think it's always been the American experience for the progressive Jewish community of the blessing of a welcoming community that comes with it, the opportunity for assimilation, and how we maintain the particularism of our tradition while still, feeling fully immersed and part of the secular American culture. And there's nothing like a bout of anti-Semitism in one's backyard to remind us that we are not fully welcome, we are not fully ingrained, and we are still other. And many of us know that here in our own neighborhood in Sylvan Park, which is Rabbi, a neighborhood within Nashville, about a stone's throw from West End Synagogue, where Rabbi Kolek is the rabbi. We had multiple spates of vandalism this last weekend, of swastikas spray painted on people's homes, the words white power, and that comes on the heels of lots of anti-Semitic pamphlets and leaflets being spread throughout various neighborhoods here in Nashville. And even though Tennessee is incredibly conservative, and I would say almost bordering on ultra conservative, given the activities of our legislature recently, we've always thought of Nashville as sort of this bubble of social progressive liberalism, even if it's more moderate than other places like where you are in New York. And we're seeing that there's kind of this carte blanche invitation to remind those of us who are part of the Jewish community and the Muslim community and the immigrant community at large that this place is not for us. This is not a new trend, right? We've been dealing with this, I would say, before Tree of Life, and certainly after. And I just wonder what you're seeing or what your concerns are. I know you've spoken about this quite substantially, about anti-Semitism in America today, and how comfortable we should or can feel as Jews in the United States.
Well, so this is an evolving landscape. And I think about the fact that just last week I saw the Broadway show Parade, which is based on the true story of the lynching of Leo Frank, who was an Atlanta Jew who in 1913 was convicted of murdering this 13-year-old in the pencil factory where he worked. And it was basically a completely botched trial in which they basically coached witnesses and he was easy to hate in Atlanta because he was like a Yankee Jew who wasn't even a Southerner, and he was Jewish. And anyway, it was interestingly, I saw this show Parade when it first came out in 1999, and then I saw it again last week. So the show affected me massively differently this time, because in 1999, I would venture to say that if you asked me, and we were basically about, we were in rabbinical school then, I would have said, I think anti-Semitism is over in America. I really kind of thought that it had basically completely disappeared. So watching Parade was like watching an interesting nostalgia piece of like, a bygone era of anti-Semitism in America. Watching it this time, I felt like I was, I couldn't stop crying through the whole second half of the show, but more than that, it felt like prescient in a way that was frightening to me. And so I'm in a very different, I think the Jewish community is in a very different place than we were before. I do think that there is something about having a shared enemy that can be at its best unifying or galvanizing. So the lynching of Leo Frank was the reason that the Anti-Defamation League was formed. It really was a direct response to the lynching of Leo Frank. And then, that's been our fight for, against anti-Semitism and hate of all kinds for the last 100 years plus. And, it's interesting. I happened to watch a movie recently about the Korean American community. And what was interesting is the watershed moment for the Korean American community was the riots, the LA riots, and in 1994, whatever it was. I'm trying to think exactly what year it was, but anyway, I should know. But interestingly, this documentary just shows Korean after Korean, most of them in LA, saying this is when we became Korean Americans. It was when it was out of a sort of shared oppression / marginalization / just outright violence, even that they recognized they actually created a political identity that was different than what they were before. Before they were transplanted Koreans, but suddenly they created an identity that came out of that. Now, in some ways, it feels really sad to me that identity sometimes gets forged out of a sense of otherness and oppression. Unfortunately, that is human nature, though, and we've seen it happen over and over again. And there is a fundamental sort of existential state of Jewishness, which is to be a stranger wherever we are. And, even our name of being Ivrim, which are Hebrews, we are people who cross over a boundary, because the very first Jews, Abraham and Sarah, are not allowed to become Jews in the safety of their home. They actually have to leave what's comfortable and become strangers somewhere else, because there's something deep about what it means to be a Jew that is about understanding the soul of being a stranger and being an outsider. So in some ways, we are reconnecting with a state of marginalization that is not something that we would ever seek out. But I think it can be used to bring our community into greater empathy and cohesion in some way, if we do this right and we have good leadership that helps us get there.
Yeah.
It's an interesting segue to ask you a bit about Israel, because first what you were saying before reminded me of in terms of the particular that comes from a behavior that is also an ongoing Jewish conversation, that in the Middle Ages will be between Maimonides, who was, we are what we do, and so it's through our actions that we shape our identities. And then it was Yehuda Levi, who would say that we still have like the special soul of sorts, which creates the seeds for some versions. I don't think that this is what Yehuda Levi wanted, but the seeds for some sort of a Jewish supremacist, detour that is very worrying, but explains some of what's going on right now in Israel. And then I was reading the other day, maybe yesterday, the day before, Danny Gordis came out with some piece saying that if Israel disappears because of what's going on right now, American Judaism will disappear as well. And so I don't know if you read the piece or not, but I wanted to invite you to reflect on what's going on right now in Israel. Is there anything that we can do? How much, what is the amount of worry that we should, have, and anything else that you want to help think about what's going on there?
And if I can just jump on my colleague's question before you answer, Rabbi, which is, if you hadn't seen the Danny Gordis piece, I'm sure you've seen the Thomas Friedman piece where he references the death by Israel sermon. And I was thinking about, if I look back at all the different sermons I've given about Israel and on Israel, even when I've had solid reason to be critical, there's always been an undertone of, we still support Israel regardless, at any cost, at all times. And the conversation today with what's going on in Israel feels like a shift and feels different. And that's, I think, frightening for us as Jewish leaders. So I'll add that to the mix in your response. Good luck.
So I have not read the Danny Gordis piece. I'm just going to take issue with the premise that if Israel disappears, that American Judaism disappears. I mean, American Judaism was around before the state of Israel was founded, and I think we're going to still survive. Now, I say that even though I would credit that much of my own Jewish identity was forged in the state of Israel, and I probably would not be a rabbi were it not for multiple trips to Israel I had at formative stages of my life. So I don't know that I would be a rabbi or the Jew I am today if I hadn't been to Israel many times. But that being aside, I think American Judaism is going to survive. I think it would be changed and shifted radically. By the way, it continues to change and shift because Israel exists. So I think, here's what I would like to say. I would like to separate out the government, the current and changing governments of the state of Israel from the people of Israel and the state itself, like this entity that I think exists and exists outside of just whatever government is ruling. In the same way that we can very distinctly, I think, separate out that there is an America that is not just Biden, or an America that was not just Trump when he was president and his administration. So I think we don't have a hard time making that separation. And we don't just say, oh yeah, America is X because whatever someone's policy is. There's much, much more to America. So I would begin by saying that I will not give up on Israel, no matter what. That is, I am committed to Israel. That being said, I am right now fighting and will speak against this current government with everything I have, because it actually, I think, is extremely harmful to the larger entity of the state of Israel that I support. So, I give an Israel sermon and I sweat it out every single time I give an Israel sermon. When I gave a High Holidays Israel sermon, there was one where literally the week before I gave the sermon, my president said to me, maybe, Angela, you just want to reuse and recycle one of your old sermons, because I just think that you're just going to get under fire for this one. And by the way, I had several congregants who didn't give me their donation that year, and two of those three families actually left the synagogue over the sermon, which, by the way, if you were to read it today, you'd probably say it doesn't even seem particularly controversial, but it was the first time that I said the word occupation from our bima. It was the first time that I gave some critique of Israel in a very public way. So, some people will just will not abide any criticism, even when it comes from a place of deep love and Zionism, which I think most people understood. So I think that in my most recent sermon I was hearing from my community things like, if Israel goes down this road, I'm out. Or congregants saying, I'm not going to give my donation to UJA this year, or I will earmark it that they can't give any of it to Israel. And I guess what I had to argue and what I want to say is that, like, especially right now, we need to be investing in Israel, but investing in the Israel that we want to support, which includes organizations and NGOs and communities that are expressing the kind of democratic ideals, the civil society, the shared society with Palestinians, the pluralism that we want to see. So for me, that means supporting liberal synagogues there. It means supporting Encounter, which brings Israelis to see Palestinians in the West Bank. It means supporting civil society infrastructure through different organizations that I've supported. I have the privilege of serving on an advisory board for the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, which is our taxpayer dollars gives $250 million to Israel over the next 5 years for people-to-people partnership programs between Palestinians and Israelis. And so the advisory board just went to Israel in February, and we got to see the first 10 grantees. And what I saw was remarkable. It's what they would call the privatization of the peace process, meaning this peace process is too important to leave to the government because basically they're not doing it. So what I saw was organizations that are doing what they would call healthcare diplomacy, Palestinian hospitals and Israeli hospitals where the doctors or the nurses are training together, doing research together, saving lives. Climate change diplomacy, where you have Palestinians and Israelis who, by the way, many of whom would say, I'm not interested in doing peace work. But one Israeli said, my family didn't understand why I was working with Palestinians until I showed them where the Jordan River comes from the West Bank into Israel. And the Jordan River is now basically a sewage dump because we do not have proper sewage cleansing things in the West Bank. And guess what? That water in the Jordan up in the West Bank, it's the same water that comes down into Israel. And so we suddenly realize that we're in this together. We can't actually say that there's just a boundary or a border here and we don't have to care about what's happening on the other side. So you see a whole climate change diplomacy that's happening. I saw tech companies that are Israeli tech companies can't survive without greater skilled labor. There is a burgeoning tech industry in Gaza, of all places. There's Gaza Tech Geeks, and I'm at this Gaza Gateways organization. They're doing IT work. What's beautiful about that is you can do it all from wherever you are. You don't have to actually travel into Israel. And by the way, there's actually a lot of skilled labor there, and it's bringing up the GDP of the area. And so essentially what you're seeing is that there's tech diplomacy that's happening. Basically, the more that we can bring Israelis and Palestinians in interconnection, both to see each other as human, but also to be interconnected, interdependent on each other, because the bottom line is we have to come to the realization that there is going to be a shared destiny here, one way or another. And I think when we talk about Israel, we have to talk about Israel and not ignore that 20% of Israel's citizens are Palestinians, let alone those who are in occupied territory within Israel. I'm not like I don't characterize myself on one end of the spectrum or another. I really try to see things from a place of balance. But I would just say that that's for me, coming back from that trip, I felt like this is what we need to invest in. This is what we need to be doing. We don't have to say that this is hopeless. And by the way, all those people that I see on the ground, they don't have the luxury of despair or saying, I'm done with Israel. They have to stay in this, and they have to stay optimistic, and they have to keep working at it. And so I want to support all those Israelis, because by the way, as you see, with hundreds of thousands marching every single week, the vast majority of Israelis want to see a different future also.
Yeah, thank you so much. Wow. You have just a smidge of passion on that subject. but we all really appreciate it. I'm going to make a significant pivot. I know, again, we will have an opportunity for questions. So if you want to probe further on that topic, we can go back there, but we are limited in time, and I'll jump on this idea of tech. We are 60 strong in this Zoom space right now, and it's been a gift that we can come together this way, and that we can have someone like you with us without you having to head over to LaGuardia and jump on a flight and come down to Nashville. But it continues to be this struggle, I think. How do we want to be a community going forward in this post-COVID era? And I don't even know if we're post-COVID. I think we're just post same level of fear of COVID in the same way as we once were. It's nice to have an alternative option to be in community, but it's not the same as sitting around a table with coffee and having a dialogue with your fellow congregants or sitting arm to arm in services, singing together. So I'm curious what you're seeing at Central and some of the things that you all are doing to embrace these different modes of coming together, and what are you struggling with there, if anything at all?
Oh, definitely. We are struggling with a lot of the same things. I mean, I think in different ways, but I guess the first thing I'd say is there's some things of what technology has opened up and opportunities that we're never going to go back on, and we're always going to keep open. So we have actually been live streaming for 13 years. So we were live streaming a long time ago, back when it was like 50 people who were watching only if they were homebound or in a hospital bed. So for example, we thought for our conversion program, our Center for Exploring Judaism, we refused to do that online because we were like, it's better if you're in person. Well, when the pandemic hit and we had to do it online and we had no choice, we realized that it's not so bad. And actually there were a bunch of international or, outside of New York students that really wanted to join us. And so now we will always have an online option. And just to give you a sense of where we are, we now have an online membership model called The Neighborhood at Central, and you can become a neighbor of Central. And we have actually daily touch points on our own kind of platform for the people who are neighbors. So that's going to continue. We actually hired our first rabbi, full-time rabbi for online engagement at Central. So that means that his entire job is interacting with our neighbors, with our live streamers, and with our members who increasingly are not always in person in New York. Some of them go to Florida for many months, as you might imagine, or just our neighbors members who actually have always lived somewhere outside of Central. So there's a world that we're going to continue to explore. I think one of the hard things was as much as I love those things, and I think this is great and I love being here, I would rather come in and giving you a hug, Lori, and having lunch with you and your colleagues and with Flip and with Rabbi Kulik and all of you afterward, because it's really not the same. And so I think what we have to do is we have to remind ourselves of what it is to actually be in person and lean into the strengths of that. And in some ways, that also means more embodied practice in some ways. So, interestingly, we did a big Shabbat. And one of the things about big Shabbat was we wanted to remind people what it felt like to just be in person again. And so we invite everyone to come for lots of different experiences of Shabbat, which included a walk in Central Park with looking at the birds. I did a yoga practice. And part of that was literally about embodying Shabbat in a way that you had to be physically present for it to actually feel what it is and what's real. So I'm happy to say that people are back at services at Central, and it's full in the sanctuary again. That it makes a world of difference to have the energy that you cannot replicate anyway, but actually having people there. But I think that we have to lean into the things that can come from only being in person. So when I do a teaching, for example, I will always start with something that's sharing between people individually, so that there's some way that the meeting is happening. And we are back to work in person, but now it's 4 days a week you have to be in instead of 5. We've kind of embraced this new reality that people don't have to come in 5 days a week, but they do have to come in still 4 days a week. We are in the people business. And one of the things I miss the most is we got our work done in the Zoom meetings, but all that stuff that's the tendons between the bones that happens in the meeting, right when you walk out and you talk about your day or what's happening with your mother or whatever it is, that stuff was all missing. And so, it's trying to recapture that and remind people of that. I just read a really amazing book called The Science of Awe, A-W-E, awe, by this scientist from Berkeley named Dacher Keltner. And he talks about how people experience awe across 26 different cultures. So this is the kind of awe that is not about whether or not you're from Nashville or New York or Africa. It is the kind of awe that all humans experience across time and space. And what was interesting is, many of the categories that you might imagine were there, including nature. Nature is a great source of awe. Music is a great source of awe. Life and death, experiencing life and death or getting close to that so all those things, you probably guessed those. But the number 1 and number 2 on the list were 2 that surprised me, although you'll probably recognize it. Number 1 is what he calls moral beauty, which is experiencing the extraordinary kind of kindness, courage, resilience, ability to withstand suffering of other human beings. Like, you know what that's like when you hear these stories of like people's kind of extraordinary moral, amazingness, that like the extraordinary things that ordinary human beings do. That's actually the number one source of awe across all cultures of all peoples. And I think you probably, once you start to think of that as a category, that language, you'll start to actually recognize moral beauty all around you. But the number two thing was what he called collective effervescence, which is a term that comes from Emil Durkheim, who was a phenomenology of religion like specialist, essentially from the early 20th century. And that's essentially human beings moving together as we're supposed to move. This is something you cannot get on Zoom. It's literally people moving together. So he talks about everything from, like, of course, the standard things you think of, like ritual dance or like going to a rave. It also includes like doing the wave at a sports game, or it includes even in New York, people kind of moving onto the subways in the morning commute in ways that like you're just part of a mass of humanity that's kind of like synchronized in a weird way. He talks about walking together as one of the simplest collective effervescence things. That includes like if you've ever been in a marching band, or if you're in the military and you march together, or even marching in a protest. That's a simple form of collective effervescence. But essentially, it requires multiple human beings moving together in some way, in a unified way. And essentially, I was thinking about that is like, that's the thing that we completely lost when we were all in our silos and when we're on computers. Collective effervescence, the number two thing that actually, he says, creates a sense of awe in the world. And awe, by the way, is not just for its own sake. Awe leads us to feel a sense that we're part of something bigger and more interconnected to other human beings and the world around us, and all these other good things that religious life is supposed to inculcate in us. So I would just say, one of the things that I did when we first came back in services for the high holidays, not because I knew this language, but just because I knew that moving together does something, I brought in a choreographer. And in our high holiday services, we actually taught everyone a choreography that had been, it's hard to explain what it is, but people gave different prayers. And this choreographer, her name is Liz Lerman, did a motion for each one of the prayers. And then she taught everyone the motion. And then you had 2,000 people at high holidays doing this movement together. It was like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And I hadn't had the language of collective effervescence yet, but that was essentially what it is. And what I wanted when we were back together for the first time as a huge mass of people, I wanted the people to feel the power of what it was to be with a lot of people again, because it was the first time. And so I think that that's those kind of embodied practices is what I think we need to lean into to remind people this is what you were missing.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Should we do questions from the audience?
I think we should. Yes. All right. So if you can just use your either your real or your Zoom hand, we'll take real hands too. And then you can unmute. If you have a question or a follow-up, we hit a number of topics. I'm scanning.
I was very glad you hit the ones that you, Jay, wanted you to hit. Israel, anti-Semitism, Jewish people.
Yeah, all the above.
We covered those at least.
All right. So follow-up question or comment. It's hard for me to see everybody. Pam has her hand raised. Oh, go ahead, Pam.
Yes, hello and good afternoon, everyone. I think one thing that really especially spoke to me during everything that was said was about Jewish identity. As someone who has converted to Judaism several years ago, Rabbi Lori is exactly right. It's not the prayers or even learning Hebrew. It's feeling of like I don't have that biological connection. And sometimes I'm reminded of that, even, during conversations or services or things with that. And what's really been particularly helpful for me is that just Torah, because it wasn't that everybody was, oh, you are, you're a child of Israel, you're Jewish. There were people who actually that actually joined, that was part. And they weren't described any differently than being just part of. So I think for that, it is and it's still sometimes a challenge. So I'm not really sure what the solution of that is. But I know that being surrounded by good people and friends that tell me, Pam, you're part of the tribe, and don't apologize for all the questions. So thank you very much.
Pam,
Thank you.
absolutely. And I would add too that it doesn't just that feeling of otherness. And Bruce, I see you. I'm coming to you next. It doesn't just happen to somebody who's, newly converted to Judaism, but it can happen to someone like me if I walk into a space, that perhaps is more rigorously religious. Maybe it's an Orthodox community, or it's family members who have a sense that their denominational affiliation is more pure or more real. And all of a sudden, there's a false strength in feeling better than, and that's where it comes from. And but we like to say there's no place for that in our Nashville Jewish community, and I truly believe that most of us do not function in that way. So you are building muscle that will serve you well, but yes, you are as authentic as they come, and I hope you continue to feel that way. Angela, I didn't mean to, if you wanted to jump in. Sorry.
No, that is beautiful, and you are in the right community hearing that. And I would just share two quick things. One is that maybe the most famous convert in our Torah is Ruth, right? And she, joins our people, and I don't know if you know, the end of that story is that she gives birth to a child who ends up, then she becomes the grandmother, of King David, who is then the progenitor of the Messiah. I think our tradition is saying something wild and radical, which is that like the messianic line came from someone who joined the Jewish people later. So like, if that doesn't help you understand that people who join our people are among the most elevated, or you're going to be the ones who save us. It's something to think about. And the second thing I would just say that I completely agree with what Lori said, that even Jews with two Jewish parents can feel this way. But I would just say that feeling of sometimes feeling like you're the other, it might be among the most Jewish things about you, Pam. And that's not something that you have to feel is bad. In fact, in some ways, it can help cultivate the empathy and creativity that I think has been the genius of the Jewish people. So embrace it.
Thank you, Bruce. And then I see Ellen and Steve have a hand up as well.
Hi, Rabbi. Thank you. This has been terrific. We're in Nashville now, but we moved down from New York. We were at Temple Israel Center, but followed your career from Westchester to Central Synagogue. And so this is a bit of a softball, maybe. You talked about the effervescence and the relation from movement. What about the role of music in that? And does that work virtually?
Well, music was my first and primary connection to God, spirituality, the Jewish community, awe, all of the above. And it continues to sort of still be my primary, most organic spiritual language, I would say. And so, I could go on and on about this. It is a softball, but I would say, in terms of how it translates, I think the hard thing is music is not just something you hear, but if you actually produce the music, it actually resonates in your own body in different ways as well. And affects us. So I think that what gets lost is when we're only singing in our own little room, watching something, or if we're hearing it, but we're not actually participating in it, or we're not surrounded by other people singing around with us, it doesn't do the same thing. They actually have studies that talk about when people sing together, they start to breathe together, like literally like things biologically start to connect us with other human beings when we sing together and make music together. So I think about that. That's lost if we're kind of each in our separate little pod or place. So all I can say is, yes, I still think music can have tremendous impact, even when we're separated. But I think it's more powerful when we can make it together. And that is one of the things that I felt really, really profoundly when we started to have people come back into services again.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Ellen or Steve, I'm not sure which one of you has the. Steve, go ahead.
It's Steve, and
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi. In terms of the discussion earlier about what's going on in Israel and the sharp divide there, it's not only Israel, it's in the United States that we have an extremely sharp divide. And I think even, and I've talked to Rabbi Kulik about this, that I think it has inhibited some of our ability to talk to one another because we're so poorly divided on this. And I'd be curious to know what your impact on how we can bridge that gap, even if we do think differently about how our politics should take place.
Yeah, you're totally right. We are just a more polarized society, I think, worldwide. I mean, if you can see what's happening in other countries aside from America and Israel too, like it's just you are just seeing people pulled to more extremes. I think that we have to have like a radical embrace of the Jewish value of valuing dissent and debate. Going back to the time of the Talmud, we were never, it's interesting that the time that the Talmud was codified in the 4th century, the Christian community was codifying the Nicene Creed, which was to create a uniform canon of religious belief for all of Christendom. And so at the same time that Christianity was trying to say there is one way to believe, we were codifying a Talmud which said, here are what multiple rabbis disagreed about. Virtually every conversation about Jewish law in the Talmud is actually, here's the minority and majority opinion, and here's, by the way, a third opinion. And then you can read some commentaries on that where they also disagree. So like the idea that we did not give a uniform practice at a time when the idea was people wanted that. We actually, I think Jews are well practiced in the art of actually speaking with and learning from people who think differently than we are. This is one of the gifts we could bring the world right now. That means we actually have to model it and do it, which is much harder to do than it is to say. It means actually sitting with people who these days, we not only feel like we think differently, we start to think they're actually bad people if they believe that. And that's become really hard because who wants to sit with someone who's bad? And I guess starting with a curiosity of why do you think that? And actually asking that, what's at the root of that belief? What are you worried about? Asking people, what are you worried about when you say that? I get very upset when I hear like, I think there's been a bunch of this, I think in Nashville around, like, let's say trans legislation that's happening all over the country. Like we could just say, these are bad people, or we could say, what are people concerned about or worried about for their children, for their families, what it means for what it says about themselves. Like if we could actually get a little more curious as opposed to just starting with a label of these people are, bigoted or mean or whatever spirited. And I think that we could fill in the blank on any number of issues on abortion, on immigration. There are so many issues. And I think to try to understand that, I think that synagogues and the fall of church membership and synagogue membership has been part of the problem, because it used to be that church was the place that people who had different political ideas would still sit together in the pews and get to know each other as human beings. And that's fallen by the wayside. Like church attendance has dropped precipitously. And I think that, and also churches and synagogues emphasize this idea of like, we're working towards some higher power. Like we're working towards an ideal that's bigger than any of our petty differences. And not petty, some of them are significant, important differences, but even then there's something bigger than that. And I think we have to reconnect with that. By the way, it might also, I would say a strategy is do less social media. I really think that social media is engineered to make us see the other side as hateful and venomous and dehumanized. So read what you need to read, but probably don't go down that rabbit hole. If you want to learn more, ask a question of someone who thinks differently about why they think differently. I think that we have to kind of get back to that.
I brought this up before, but it's exactly what you're speaking to, this rather than seeking conflict resolution, we're seeking, what's the word? Conflict transformation. And the conflict transformation beckons us to ask, tell me why it is you feel that way. Help me understand. I'd love to see that side of it. Tell me more. So it's not that we have to come to some level of agreement, but we want to come to some level of understanding and a closer connection to one another through that conversation. Okay. I always like to preface this by saying, Mom, do you have a question? Or is it a statement? Sue, go ahead.
Hello, Angela.
Hi, Sue. How are you?
Okay.
Nice to see you here.
It's very nice to see you. And I think the class of 2001 didn't do too poorly.
I had a good study partner.
Good study partner. And my friend, your past president and colleague, David Edelson, I'm sure has a dartboard with my face on it. But one of the things you were talking about, particularly in Israel, working together, reminds me of the teachers' room and what the college has done with the Arab teachers and the Israeli teachers working together. And I'm assuming these are the kinds of programs that you were alluding to.
Absolutely.
More of. And perhaps how can we do that in our own communities as well? What is your
I mean, specifically about Israel, or just in general around polarized like communities?
In general, how do we bring them in?
So one of the, I don't know, I can't pretend that I'm an expert at this, but what I have learned is sometimes when your topic is the thing that is the point of division, it sometimes is very hard to say, okay, we're going to come in the room and we're going to talk about X, Israel, whatever it is. Sometimes it really helps to begin the relationship by two groups that might have very different views, actually working on something bigger than themselves or something outside of that issue of conflict. And that becomes the place where you start to meet each other. So for example, if you have like, let's say, I'm just making this up, there's a church in your community that you feel like does not that you have some conflict around Israel on, like, the Presbyterian Church has divested from Israel and whatever else, all that. Let's just say, instead of starting by having a conversation about Israel, let's say there's a homelessness problem here. We want to work on that together. And that is actually the point of like getting to know each other in your humanity, working towards something. In many ways, the projects that I shared that I saw in Israel recently, many of them are people who were not going to come into a dialogue, a peace building dialogue conversation, but they were willing to come in on a conversation about saving people's lives in the hospital, or around, as I said, climate change in the Jordan River, or around, the need for shared tech in whatever else. And so I think that once you actually, there's a group that's doing date honey, Palestinian farmers and Israeli farmers. Well, they have shared issues of like pesticide issues with these little bugs that are that don't care about the boundaries between their two farms. And so they're actually going to come together to research options for pest control within their things. So like, they might not be people who are saying we're going to be doing peace building work, but you start with actually a shared common interest. Then you get to know each other. Then you break bread together. And then you can actually begin to build a relationship. I think that that's one piece of what I would say is I think that you find an area in which you have some area you want to work together. I think beyond that, there are good dialogue groups that like give ground rules so you can have safe conversations. There's a group organization called Setting the Table that brings Jews together on different sides to talk about Israel. And they have some very good ground rules so you can talk about a topic that's relatively toxic to talk about with people who think differently. And the ground rules create a sense of safety. So I would say, either you start talking with about something different to begin, or you set some ground rules so that you can have a conversation that people can feel safe, at least beginning to explore, and start with I statements and feelings and all of that. Like, I think those are among the ways we think and talk. There's a whole school of like nonviolent communication, which is sort of interesting because the idea of violent communication, we know what violent communication feels like when we get it. It's like starting the conversation by saying, well, you're a racist. You do that, you basically cut that person and the conversation's over. So, we all could actually cultivate those skills of nonviolent communication a little bit better as well, too.
Thank you.
So
Go ahead, Rabbi.
Yeah, no, we began the conversation talking about diversity, and we spoke about the embodied practices that define our own particularity. And then, we mentioned how radical was the Talmud in bringing people with different ideas back to the same table. And I think that is the challenge that every synagogue and other organizations, but certainly synagogues, whether in Nashville, in New York, or anywhere else, have, and it's part of the challenge, how we bring people together with diverse ideas and practices and genders and everything, how we bring all of us together in the development of an embodied practice that will allow for that communal effervescence to come back up, because that effervescence also depends on how awesome do we do with the difference. Because if we are all the same, it's not the same type of bubbling that
You're right.
we created. So we want to thank you, Rabbi, for allowing this moment of reflection, this introduction to awe by a different way, and for coming virtually to Nashville. But as you well said, you have to come in person because it's not the same. So
Baruch Hashem, that will happen. Thank you.
there you go. And to everybody else, thank you so much. Lori, do you want to say anything?
No, thank you so much, Rabbi Buchdahl, for being with us. It was truly a treat. What a wonderful break in our day. And to everybody else, we hope you have a healthy, safe rest of your week. An early Shabbat Shalom to all. And if you are starting to clean for Seder next week, good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.